Good evening. This is the first Substack newsletter for the Solutions newsletter that I am doing by video. The title is An Unhappy Start to 2026. This is not the edition I plan to publish as the first edition of 2026. However, circumstances with breaking news this morning have significantly changed my plans. As a Naval Academy graduate who served on nuclear submarines in the Cold War and Vietnam War regions, and who has taken the oath of office to support and defend the Constitution 8 times in my life, I feel an obligation to comment on the military action in Venezuela. Also, as a veteran, I admire the skill and bravery of the U.S. military to execute the complex action required to enter Venezuela and successfully capture Maduro without the loss of a single U.S. service member or piece of military equipment. That is an indication of the professionalism, the skill, and the leadership we have in the military today. However, there are serious concerns with the decision to undertake this action. Point 1. This extensive use of military force to essentially invade a sovereign nation in order to capture and remove its president is an action that requires the agreement of Congress. The authority for such an action should have been sought before beginning the planning for the operation, without disclosing any specifics regarding timetable or military plans. But the justification for such a move at some point in the future should have been considered by Congress leadership and agreed. Then, when our forces entered Venezuelan territory, congressional leadership should have been informed that the action they granted authority for were being taken. Why should we as citizens care about the absence of these steps? In our Constitution, only Congress can declare war. In recent times, this has been extended to mean that only Congress can authorize major military action to be taken against a specific adversary. As Commander-in-Chief, the President, of course, has authority to use military force that hasn't been previously authorized, but only to defend U.S. personnel or interests where urgent action is necessary. This is not the case this morning. When an administration and a president decide they do not need to honor the Constitution, our republic is in grave danger. The Constitution was carefully and intelligently designed by our founders to establish and protect our republic from the authoritarian control of a single person or even a single branch of government. It is a slippery slope indeed that can quickly lead to violations of other laws and individual rights protected by our Constitution. Of most concern, it can lead to undermining the fairness and legality of elections that determine the makeup of the next Congress. If any readers believe that one party governing, led by a single executive with nearly unlimited powers to act without constraints, is preferred over an executive who is required to follow the law and share decisions with Congress as required by our Constitution, please consider these questions. What nations are governed by one party and a single executive with almost unlimited power? They exist in the world today. Don't communist nations such as China and Russia fit that description? As well, don't the theocracies like Iran and Saudi Arabia also fit that description? Are you really in favor of trading our constitutional republic for a government like one of these? Point 2. The justification for the actions has been stated as the necessity to arrest a person under indictment in the U.S. for narco-terrorism charges. However, this is a charge only under U.S. law, not international law. In order for the U.S. to arrest a foreign national without the sovereignty of another nation, A treaty involving mutual extradition must ordinarily exist. In certain circumstances like terrorism, Congress may and has in the past authorized such action, which is historically taken only with the concurrence of international allies. These requirements were not part of the action this morning. Point 3. The arrest and removal of the civil authority in the country now requires a plan for how that civil authority is replaced. Such a plan involves the commitment of U.S. resources and the assumption by the U.S. of responsibility for the outcome in the society, and should certainly be a decision agreed by Congress. This action essentially requires the U.S. to run the country, which is a commitment that goes well beyond just the action to arrest an individual outside of our borders, and well beyond any presidential authority granted in our Constitution. Point 4. As part of the justification, President Trump claimed the U.S. has a right to seek the return of our oil, confiscated by the Venezuelan regime under nationalizing the equipment owned by U.S. oil companies decades ago. The U.S. has every legal right to recover the invested assets taken by nationalization through actions short of invasion. But the oil and the land under which it sits is not the property of the U.S. It belongs to the people of Venezuela. If the U.S. is going to operate the extradition and sale of that oil in the coming months, it should be under an agreement that clearly states how much of the value received for the sale of the oil would accrue to Venezuela and how much would accrue to the U.S. companies in return for their past and current investments. There should not be a share for the U.S. Treasury. If this process is not developed with congressional approval and is totally transparent in its operations, it could be accurately perceived as the theft of a nation's resource by a stronger military force. That is also not what America stands for. Point 5. Finally, we have essentially heard the president justify the invasion of a smaller and weaker country by a stronger military force on the basis that the smaller government was not legitimate, that the seizing of the resources were necessary for the national security of the stronger government, and that the stronger government had a right to police and perhaps even choose the type of government and even the specific leaders for the smaller country. This is not an extension of the Monroe Doctrine as the president has claimed. The Monroe Doctrine was about ending the interference of European nations in the colonization of countries in the Western Hemisphere. It was not about the U.S. right to determine the government of each sovereign nation within the Western Hemisphere. In fact, these justifications would be closer to Putin and Xi doctrines than to any doctrine declared by a U.S. president in our 250-year history. If the president can unilaterally declare the Western Hemisphere as the sphere of influence for the U.S., and that the U.S. therefore has the unilateral right to cause regime change and take the national resources of countries within our sphere of influence, then wouldn't the Russian president have the same right within Eastern Europe? And the Chinese president have the same right within the Western Pacific? Wouldn't it be a bit of hypocrisy for the U.S. president to object to Russia's right to invade Ukraine and China's right to invade Taiwan if made under the same justifications used by President Trump to invade Venezuela? Here's a short story on the value of applying the lessons of history. At the end of World War II, the U.S. led the world to develop an approach to preserving global peace and security based on respecting the sovereignty of each nation and settling disputes by international law, not by military aggression. The division of the world into armed camps, with stronger countries believing they have the right to invade and control weaker countries, is what led to 2 world wars within a generation. This agreement between the nations of the world since World War II has avoided another world war between the major military powers in the world for the last 80 years. That is what America has stood for. Beyond the concerns of the impact of this morning's actions for the internal risks it represents for our constitutional republic, the risk it represents for the global peace and security of the world should perhaps be a greater concern. Without the commitment of our government to adhere to the rule of law, the state of the U.S. Republic may fall into a state of perpetual division under authoritarian law. And without the commitment of the governments of the world to adhere to the principles of international law, the state of the global community may fall once again into a state of aggression and conflict. Here's a short second story about the lessons of history. American leaders had the wisdom to apply the lessons of the post-World War I era in how to treat the defeated nations in World War II. We did not seek to take financial advantage or reparations from either Japan or Germany after their complete surrender at the end of World War II. We did not act in retribution for their actions to begin the war. Instead, we passed something called the Marshall Plan and invested in helping Japan and Germany rebuild their countries and their economies after the destruction they experienced during the war, and help them establish democratic governments to embrace principles like the separation of powers and the rule of law to help minimize the chance that authoritarian regimes would reemerge. That wisdom enabled Japan and Germany to become some of our strongest allies in the contest against authoritarian regimes during the Cold War and in the 80 years since. That is the incalculable value for what America stands for. To paraphrase a famous philosopher's quote, those who ignore the lessons of history are bound to repeat them. I hope the U.S. administration might see the value of embracing these lessons of history that literally changed the world and provided long-term prosperity and security for the U.S. and the world over the last 80 years, and that they will choose to avoid seeking only short-term financial advantages for ourselves. Thanks for listening. Have a great New Year.